Scatterbrain, a track from Radiohead's 2003 album Hail to the Thief, is a pretty underrated song in my opinion. I recently learned how to play it, and I was pleasantly surprised by how elegant its composition is from a music theory standpoint. Let's take a listen. The song starts with a simple, repeated guitar riff, arpeggiating 4 chords. What exactly are these chords? The first chord consists of C, A, and E, notes which constitute an A minor triad. The voicing is kind of unusual though, with the C in the bass. In fact, I think you could also call this a C major 6 chord, voiced without its fifth. After all, the bass note of a chord often wants to be heard as the chord's root note. All 4 of these chords are voiced with the same shape, so you can apply these interpretations to each of them. On one hand, considering what triad the notes form, you can hear the chords as A minor, G major, F major, and E minor. But if you consider the bass note, you can also hear them as C major 6, B minor flat 6, A minor flat 6, and G major 6. I don't think either of these interpretations is necessarily right. You might even say that each chord sounds like a blend of each interpretation. But for the sake of convenience, you might want to pick one of the options for each chord based simply on how the chord sounds to you. Personally, I feel like this chord progression sounds most like C major 6, G major, F major, E minor. Or maybe C major 6, G major, F major, G major 6. In either case, the harmonic context seems pretty clear. With no sharps or flats, we're in the key of C major and the chords form a pretty basic diatonic progression starting on the 1 chord. The riff repeats twice, but then the vocals come in, and immediately things become more complex. The vocal melody begins like this. All of a sudden, we have an F sharp over our C major chord. This seems to suggest not a C major scale, but a C Lydian scale, which of course is the 4th mode of the G major scale. So perhaps what we thought of as a 1-5 change was in fact a 4-1 change. Does this mean we are really in the key of G major? Perhaps not. After all, the next chord in the sequence, the F major, has an F natural, not an F sharp. If we wanted to stick to the key of G major, then we'd have to call this a flat 7 chord, which ultimately would have to be borrowed from some key with more flats, such as C major. It's as though each time we hear a 1 chord, Radiohead throws in some detail to contradict that notion. C major 6 seems like a 1 chord, but then the melody has an F sharp, making it sound more like a 4 chord. This means G would be a suitable 1 chord, but the next chord is an F, which sounds much more like a 5-4 progression than a 1 flat 7 progression. Of course, the chord progression for the verse extends a little further from here. Overall, it goes like this. The first new chord has a similar ambiguity to the previous chords, but I think the best label for it is actually as a B7 with the root note omitted. This makes the most sense from a functional harmony perspective, where in the key of G major it serves as a 3-dominant 7 chord, perhaps the most common secondary dominant, which resolves neatly to the 6 minor chord, which here is the very unambiguously voiced E minor. The final chord sort of blends these 2 previous chords, with the B7 shape on top and the E in the bass. You can think of this as sort of an E suspended chord, or as a return to the 3-dominant 7 while the previous bass note is sustained, as in a pedal point. All of this seems to suggest we are actually in G major. There, the 3-dominant 7 chord is quite common, but in C major we would have to call this the 7-dominant 7, which, while not unheard of, is certainly a bit more unusual. Still, from the end of this progression we return to the beginning, the C major 6, and there's a definite tendency to hear the first chord in a progression, indeed the first chord in the song, as the 1 chord when it would otherwise be ambiguous. But once again, Radiohead subverts features like this which might highlight the 1 chord. You may have noticed that this progression has only 7 chords lasting over 7 measures. There's generally an expectation that sections are divided into 4 or 8 or 16 measures. If this verse had lasted 8 measures, this would have created a strong sense of expectation as we loop around back to the beginning, which would have strengthened the first chord's identity as a first chord. But instead, we end up back at the first chord without having the song structure warning us ahead of time, which weakens the sense of this chord as the 1 chord. Overall, we see many ambiguities in this chord progression. First, there are ambiguous voicings for several of the chords, but beyond this there are 2 possible interpretations of the song's key, C major or G major. Many of the features which normally help us identify the key are also subverted. I think these features are reflected neatly in the song's subject matter. The word scatterbrained, after all, means to be disorganized or lacking in concentration, and the song's lyrics describe scenes of chaos and uncertainty. It's quite fitting that the chords have a similar sense of uncertainty. Together with the uneven measure count, they produce a sort of unsettled, wandering feeling which perfectly matches the bittersweet lyrics. As the song progresses, the harmonies only get more ambiguous. After a few repetitions of the verse, we come to a brief transitional section. It is pretty clear we are stepping far outside our previous keys. The first chord here is a G minor flat 6, and having just come from a few chords suggesting G major, it sounds like we might be in the parallel minor key, G minor. But then, immediately after, there is an A major flat 6. In G minor, this would be a 1 minor to 2 major change, with the 2 chord perhaps resembling a secondary dominant. Not impossible, but whenever I see a minor chord a whole step below a major or dominant chord, I immediately think 4 minor, 5 major. This would indicate we are in the key of D minor, with the E flat in the G minor flat 6 serving as a chromatic passing tone. But instead of resolving to the 1 minor chord, D minor, the A moves to an E minor, moving backwards instead of forwards in the circle of fifths. E minor is also not in the key of D minor, but rather recalls the C or G major context the song began with. So what exactly is going on in this section? It's not immediately clear what motivates these sudden changes of key, which contributes to their vaguely ominous sound. These key changes occur in the transition from the previous section, where B dominant 7 over E is followed by G minor flat 6, and also from the E minor back to G minor flat 6 as the chords in this new section repeat. Both of these are chromatic mediant chord changes. Chromatic mediants often have a creepy vibe, and doubly so when they are not firmly rooted in an unambiguous harmonic context. These chords are paired with a fairly chromatic-sounding melody to highlight their apparent lack of relationship. Yet this section still sounds fairly coherent. I think there is a strong unifying interpretation to these chords, but it won't become apparent until later on in the song. I have found this to be a feature common to several Radiohead songs, a feature which rewards careful, repeated listening. And in this case, the interpretation needs to be thought of retrospectively, as the section is not even repeated later on. For now, though, the transition section begins to repeat, with G minor flat 6 and A major flat 6, before abruptly transitioning out to C major 6 and several more repetitions of the verse. This is also a premature transition, occurring after 6 measures, which once again obscures the structural features that might lead you to hearing the C major 6 as the 1 chord. The verse repeats several more times, as before, and then finally we reach the outro section. This section consists of another arpeggiated guitar riff consisting of 4 chords. Certainly the shape of some of these voicings should be familiar at this point, but moreover, the upper melody of this riff should also be familiar. It is the same chromatic melody that we heard in the transition section earlier, shifted into a different key. Except here, as we'll see, the context is a lot clearer. The first chord, like those in the intro, could be interpreted in a few ways. Focusing on the bass note, you could call it a G major 6, with the C serving as a brief suspension, though looking at the notes as a whole, you could also call it an E minor flat 6. The next chord is less ambiguous. While it may have an A sharp in the bass, it would be hard to interpret this as anything other than an F sharp major flat 6. This is followed by a B minor and a D major 7th, also fairly unambiguous. Taking all of these chords at face value, it now appears we are in the key of D major. The chord functions for this interpretation are pretty straightforward. Particularly, that strong 3 major to 6 minor chord change strengthens this interpretation. That said, there is still a brief C natural, which vaguely suggests the key of G major. Just as with the verses, this ambiguity lies between 2 adjacent keys on the circle of fifths, though in the outro this ambiguity is less significant and the overall sound is more resolved. Moreover, this gives us a more reliable position from which to reconsider the song's earlier transition section. You may have noticed that it's not just the chromatic melody that's the same here, but also the chords themselves. E minor flat 6 to F sharp major flat 6 is essentially a transposition of G minor flat 6 to A major flat 6. It turns out that the chord functions also match pretty well. If we think of the outro as being in B minor, which is enharmonic with D major, then these two chords serve as a 4 minor to 5 major, which are the same functions I earlier attributed to the other two chords. Another similarity between the two sections is the use of chromatic approach notes. I stated that the C natural in the outro is a nod to the key of G major, but you could also simply view it as a chromatic approach note to the chord tone of B. The idea that the C natural is simply an intentional deviation from the key invites us to think of the E flat and the F natural in the transition section the same way. Before, I had stated that the G minor flat 6 and A major flat 6 were the 4 minor and 5 major in the key of D minor. It's true that this is a common harmonic trope, but if the F natural is only a chromatic approach note, it opens up the possibility that these chords serve as the 4 minor and 5 major of D major, with the 4 minor being a common borrowing from the parallel minor. Conveniently, this is the same key as the outro, and not only that, but this allows us to comfortably label the E minor in the section as a 2 minor, as it falls neatly into the key of D major. In that case, the actual chord functions of the transition section are 4 minor, 5 major, and 2 minor. The change from 2 minor to 4 minor as the section repeats is probably one of the more common positions for a chromatic medians after all. Admittedly, all of this is kind of a reach. Ultimately, this interpretation of the transition section implies that it changes to a new key that is never actually explicitly highlighted in the section itself. But as we've seen, ambiguity is the name of the game in Scatterbrain, so it makes sense for an interpretation to hinge on a highly ambiguous key. At the very least, there are significant parallels between the transition section and the outro, which lend a degree of consistency to the song overall. This concludes my music theory analysis of Scatterbrain. If you have any questions, leave a comment, and I'll do my best to explain.